Something has shifted, not gradually, not quietly, all at once, and the world is noticing. For months, analysts warned that Donald Trump's confrontational approach to America's closest allies was unsustainable, that threatening Canada's sovereignty, dismissing NATO obligations, and abandoning Ukraine's cause would eventually produce consequences, real ones, structural ones, the kind that don't reverse themselves when a new news cycle begins. That moment has arrived. World leaders, from Kyiv to Ottawa, from Berlin to Helsinki, are no longer waiting for Washington to course correct. They are not hedging. They are not sending diplomatic signals through back channels, hoping someone in the White House is paying attention. They are acting, publicly, deliberately, and with increasing coordination. Canadian provincial premiers are demanding Trump release the Epstein files on national television as leverage. European nations are pulling $800 billion to build a defense architecture that deliberately excludes American dependency. Ukraine's President Zelensky, once characterized by Trump allies as a beggar with a tin cup, has emerged as what the New York Times now calls the leader of the free world. Finland's president is telling reporters plainly that Europe needs Ukraine, not the other way around. And the United States? Washington is watching allies become competitors, partners become independent operators, and relationships built over 8 decades dissolve in real time. This is not a diplomatic spat. This is a structural realignment of global power, and it is happening faster than most Americans realize. What we are witnessing is the direct consequence of a foreign policy built on intimidation, unpredictability, and the casual abandonment of the alliances that underwrote American global leadership since 1945. When you threaten to annex an allied nation, Canada, other nations stop treating you as a reliable partner. When you walk away from Ukraine and cozy up to Putin, European capitals stop ordering American weapons. When you attack NATO publicly and praise Russia in the same breath, the alliance does not collapse. It reorganizes without you. Tonight, we break down exactly how that reorganization is unfolding, who is leading it, what it means for American power, American taxpayers, and the global order that has kept large-scale interstate war at bay for generations. The story is bigger than any single headline suggests, and it starts in Ottawa. It began with trade. It has become something else entirely. When Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods and began making public statements about Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States, most political observers expected the Canadian response to be cautious. Canada is economically intertwined with the United States in ways that make confrontation genuinely costly. Cross-border supply chains, shared energy infrastructure, decades of integrated manufacturing. Canada had every structural reason to absorb the insults quietly and wait Trump out. That calculus has changed. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew gave an interview on Canadian national television that would have been unthinkable even 18 months ago. He did not speak in the careful, measured tones of a politician protecting a trade relationship. He spoke like a leader who has concluded that accommodation is no longer working and that offense is the better strategy. Kinew called on Canada to formally demand the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files as a direct pressure tactic against the Trump administration. His reasoning was explicit. Every time the Epstein files surface, Trump's behavior becomes erratic. If Canada is in a geopolitical standoff with Washington, put the conversation on terrain where Washington is uncomfortable. He went further. He described Trump as an erratic president, fully committed to a terrible trade policy, operating with a sensitive ego that Canada's Prime Minister must navigate carefully. He told Canadians that pulling American alcohol off provincial shelves was a justified economic response, and that ordinary Americans who feel the consequences should remember it at the midterms. That is a Canadian premier on national television telling American voters how to vote. This is not typical Canadian political behavior. Canada has historically been one of America's most diplomatically restrained neighbors, careful never to inflame domestic American politics. The fact that a provincial premier is now openly commenting on U.S. midterm elections signals how thoroughly the old norms have broken down. And Canoe is not alone. Across Canada, provinces are reviewing contracts for American goods. The federal government is formally reviewing its F-35 fighter jet purchase, a contract worth billions, and looking instead towards Sweden, France, and South Korea for next-generation military hardware. Canada is deliberately redirecting defense spending away from American manufacturers. This is economic decoupling with strategic intent. Canada is not just retaliating for tariffs. Canada is hedging against a future in which the United States is no longer a reliable partner, and building alternative relationships accordingly. When America's closest neighbor and oldest trading partner begins planning for a post-American partnership model, something fundamental has changed. While Canada makes headlines, the larger transformation is happening across the Atlantic. Europe is not angry. Anger implies emotional reaction. What European governments are engaged in right now is something colder and more consequential: strategic planning for a future without American leadership. The numbers alone tell the story. The European Union's Rearm Europe plan commits approximately 800 billion euros to continental defense investment through 2030. But the composition of that spending is what matters most. The old model was straightforward. America provided the security umbrella, Europeans bought American weapons and hardware, and everyone operated under Washington's strategic direction. That model is now being deliberately dismantled. European governments are not just spending more on defense, they are routing that spending toward European manufacturers, European supply chains, and European strategic autonomy. When NATO procurement officials recently needed to replace aging early warning aircraft, the kind of capability decision that would once have automatically favored American manufacturers, they chose a design from Saab of Sweden and Bombardier of Canada. The American alternative was on the table. They passed. Ukraine has signed letters of intent to purchase advanced fighter aircraft from Sweden and France, not from the United States. The financial architecture is shifting too. The European Payments Initiative is constructing a continent-wide alternative to Visa and MasterCard. European institutions are actively seeking replacements for SWIFT, PayPal, and American-dominated financial platforms. France has moved its gold reserves from New York to Paris. German and Italian politicians are debating whether to do the same. European governments are auditing their dependency on American software, specifically out of concern that U.S. technology firms could one day be directed by Washington to cut off critical services to European clients. That fear of an American government weaponizing private technology against allied governments would have seemed paranoid in 2019. In 2025, European officials treat it as a planning assumption. Fareed Zakaria, speaking on CNN, captured the strategic reality concisely. He described meeting one of China's most prominent business figures in Shenzhen, who told him something striking. When Trump threatened to seize Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, it was more alarming to Chinese business leaders than anything happening in the Middle East, because it told them that Europe would not follow America's approach to China. The Greenland threat didn't intimidate Europe. It liberated Europe from the assumption that Washington's partnership was reliable. France is expanding its nuclear arsenal and revising its doctrine to allow nuclear-armed aircraft to operate beyond French territory. Germany has approved up to 1 trillion euros in defense and infrastructure spending, with the explicit goal of fielding the strongest military in Europe by 2039, the 100th anniversary of Germany's invasion of Poland. The symbolism is not subtle. Europe is rearming, and it is doing so independently. Perhaps the most striking geopolitical reversal of this entire period involves Ukraine. 18 months ago, Trump allies were openly suggesting Ukraine was finished, that the country would fall, that Western support was wasted, that Zelensky was an unreliable actor seeking a blank check from American taxpayers. The narrative pushed by certain corners of the American right was that Ukraine's cause was unwinnable and that America had no business being involved. The battlefield told a different story. Ukraine, a country that Russian military planners expected to dissolve within days of the 2022 invasion, has fought Russia to a strategic stalemate. More than that, it has become the most advanced laboratory for modern warfare on the planet. Ukrainian forces have developed drone technology, anti-drone countermeasures, and real-time battlefield coordination systems that no NATO member can currently match. Finland's President Alexander Stubb said it plainly in a recent interview. Europe now needs Ukraine more than Ukraine needs Europe. Ukraine's military knows how to fight this kind of war. NATO members, despite decades of spending, do not have that knowledge. The human cost has been staggering, but the strategic arithmetic is stark. Over the past 4 months, Ukrainian forces have inflicted casualties on Russian troops at a rate of 30 to 35,000 killed or wounded per month, with 95% of those losses delivered by drone, at a ratio of 1 Ukrainian casualty for every 5 Russian casualties. These are numbers that have fundamentally altered European assessments of Ukraine's military viability. The New York Times published an op-ed by David French with a title that would have been inconceivable in 2022. Meet the new leader of the free world. The argument is straightforward. By standing firm against Russian aggression, developing cutting-edge military technology, and now engaging diplomatically across Europe and the Middle East, including securing energy deals and defense partnerships, Zelensky has stepped into a leadership vacuum that Washington created by walking away. The European Union has now unlocked a $90 billion support loan for Ukraine, freed from the veto of Hungary's Viktor Orbán following the election of a new Hungarian prime minister. The first tranche is directed at domestic Ukrainian defense production, drones, military equipment, sovereign manufacturing capacity. Ukraine is not becoming dependent on European largesse. It is building an independent defense industrial base. David French's analysis cuts to the heart of the strategic blunder. The drone warfare, counter-drone systems, and battlefield technology developed in Ukraine over 3 years of combat represents some of the most valuable military innovation of the 21st century. The Biden administration's investment in Ukraine, whatever one thinks of it politically, produced a real-world testing ground for the warfare of the future. The United States, by stepping back, has forfeited access to that knowledge and handed its development to European and Ukrainian partners who are now sharing it among themselves. There is a direct line between these global developments and the American taxpayer's wallet. The Trump administration has proposed a $1.5 trillion defense budget. That figure is not incidental. It is the structural consequence of a foreign policy that has systematically dismantled the alliance architecture that allowed the United States to project global power at a fraction of what unilateral power projection would cost. For decades, the American defense burden was shared. NATO allies provided troops, bases, logistics, intelligence, and political legitimacy. South Korea and Japan anchored American presence in the Pacific. Bilateral partnerships reduced the cost of maintaining global influence. When the United States needed overflight rights, forward basing, or coalition participation, it had a network to call on. That network is not gone, but it is fragmenting in ways that will take years and possibly decades to repair, if they can be repaired at all. As David French notes in his Times analysis, allies are not just cooling relationships with Washington, they are building alternative structures, alternative supply chains, alternative financial systems, alternative security frameworks. These do not vanish when an American election produces a different result. Institutions, once built, persist. Meanwhile, Russia continues to supply Iran with weapons and military assistance. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi, even as American forces remain engaged in the region, traveled to St. Petersburg to meet personally with Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and senior Russian officials. Iran and Russia are operating as coordinated partners. Trump, in a recent interview, declined to criticize China's potential support for Iran and used his answer to praise Russia's relative restraint. He attacked NATO in the same week, publicly, on camera, stating that NATO was not there for America when it needed help. The strategic picture that emerges is this. The United States is fighting an adversarial coalition that includes Russia and Iran, while simultaneously alienating the allied coalition that would normally provide support, legitimacy, and burden sharing. The cost of that isolation falls on American taxpayers through defense budgets, on American workers through disrupted trade relationships, and on American global influence through the quiet, structural decisions that allies are making every single day. Canada is buying Swedish jets. Europe is building its own payment systems. Ukraine is arming itself with European money. NATO is purchasing Canadian and Swedish radar aircraft. None of this is reversible overnight. Some of it may not be reversible at all. The world that existed before, the one in which American leadership was assumed, American partnerships were stable, and American power operated through a vast network of willing allies, that world is being reconstructed without the United States at its center. That is not a partisan statement. It is a description of what is currently happening. The consequences will be felt not in foreign capitals, but in American communities, American budgets, and American security for a generation to come. The question now is whether enough Americans are paying attention before the architecture becomes permanent.